12th of February 1967, Operation Pershing, near An Khe, South Vietnam. Private First Class James P. Laurie lowered himself through the tunnel entrance, a hole barely wide enough for his shoulders. The air below was thick and stale, carrying the smell of damp earth and something else he could not identify. His flashlight beam cut through darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The tunnel walls pressed close on both sides, narrowing to 18 inches in places where he had to exhale completely just to squeeze through. He carried a .45 caliber pistol and a flashlight. Nothing else would fit. The 8th Cavalry Regiment had discovered this complex during a sweep operation targeting the 3rd NVA Division, and Laurie had volunteered to go down because someone had to, and waiting only made it worse. 20 feet in, the tunnel turned sharply left. He swept the flashlight around the corner and froze. Movement. A figure crouched in the darkness 3 meters ahead, motionless except for eyes that reflected the beam like an animal caught at night. Laurie's finger tightened on the trigger. The NVA soldier did not fire, did not move, just stared back through the suffocating blackness of a tunnel that had become a tomb for hundreds of men who entered and never returned. What Laurie had just discovered was not an enemy position, but the psychological reality of tunnel rat warfare, where survival depended less on firepower than on nerve, and where the Viet Cong's greatest weapon was not bullets, but the certainty that every corner might be your last. Between 1965 and 1972, fewer than 700 American soldiers volunteered to descend into over 200 miles of Viet Cong tunnel networks, and what they found underground would prove that courage was measured not in yards gained, but in feet crawled through darkness that wanted them dead. Laurie kept his pistol trained on the NVA soldier as they moved back through the tunnel in silence, broken only by the sound of boots scraping dirt and labored breathing in air that tasted like metal and decay. The captured soldier moved first, hands visible, crawling through passages that he navigated by memory while Laurie followed with flashlight beam fixed on his back. 20 feet became 40, 40 became 60. The tunnel did not end where Laurie expected. Instead, it branched left into darkness that his light could not penetrate, then right into another passage, then down through a trap door into a lower level that required dropping 8 feet into blackness before hitting packed earth below. The NVA soldier waited at each junction until Laurie signaled to continue. Neither man spoke because speaking required breath, and there was barely enough air to sustain movement through spaces where the walls pressed close enough to scrape shoulders on both sides. The Cu Chi tunnel system had been constructed over 2 decades, beginning in the late 1940s, when Viet Minh fighters first dug hiding places to escape French colonial forces. By 1965, those crude tunnels had evolved into an underground city spanning over 250 kilometers of interconnected passages linking villages, supply caches, command centers, and fighting positions across the Iron Triangle and northwest toward the Cambodian border. The tunnels operated on 3 distinct levels. The first level ran 3 meters below the surface, shallow enough for quick access, but deep enough to survive most artillery strikes. The second level descended to 6 meters, housing living quarters, storage chambers, and rudimentary hospitals where Viet Cong medics performed surgery by candlelight. The third level plunged to 12 meters depth, where command posts and ammunition factories operated in chambers carved from laterite clay that hardened like cement when exposed to air. Ventilation shafts disguised as termite mounds provided minimal airflow. Trap doors sealed with mud prevented smoke and gas from spreading between levels. The tunnels themselves measured 18 to 30 inches wide, dimensions calculated to fit Vietnamese fighters, while excluding larger American soldiers who could not physically maneuver through passages that required exhaling completely just to squeeze forward. Laurie emerged into daylight 40 minutes after entering. The captured NVA soldier was immediately secured by soldiers who had been waiting with weapons trained on the tunnel entrance, expecting either Laurie or enemy reinforcements. Intelligence officers arrived within the hour to interrogate the prisoner and debrief Laurie on what he had discovered. The tunnel he had entered connected to a network that military maps had not documented. Aerial reconnaissance could not detect entrances camouflaged with vegetation and constructed to leave no visible disturbance. Ground patrols walked over tunnel complexes daily without realizing entire battalions lived and operated 10 meters beneath their boots. The 1st Infantry Division's after-action reports documented the discovery with clinical precision, but the implications were clear to everyone who read them. If this single tunnel system extended for miles in multiple directions and on multiple levels, then the Viet Cong possessed infrastructure that conventional military operations could not destroy through bombing or artillery. The enemy was not hiding in the jungle. The enemy was living under it, invisible and unreachable except by men willing to crawl into darkness with a pistol and a flashlight to fight on terms where every advantage belonged to the defender. Orders came down within days. More tunnel rats would be needed. The realization spread through command staffs across the 3-Corps tactical zone in the weeks following Operation Pershing. Artillery could not destroy tunnels that absorbed blast waves through serpentine passages. Airstrikes could not target what aerial reconnaissance could not detect. Infantry could not secure ground when the enemy simply vanished underground and reappeared behind friendly lines. Conventional tactics had met an unconventional problem that required an unconventional solution. Someone had to go into the tunnels. Someone had to fight the Viet Cong in spaces where every advantage belonged to the defender. But the job could not be ordered. It could only be requested. Volunteers only. Captain Herbert Thornton of the 1st Infantry Division's Chemical Corps began forming specialized tunnel teams in early 1966. The selection criteria were unusual by military standards. Height mattered more than marksmanship. A soldier standing 5 feet 10 inches could not physically fit through passages that narrowed to 18 inches in critical sections. Most tunnel rats measured under 5 feet 5 inches and weighed less than 130 pounds. Wiry builds worked better than muscular frames in confined spaces where bulk became liability. But physical qualifications were only the beginning. Thornton needed men who possessed what he called an inquisitive mind, a lot of guts and a lot of real moxie in knowing what to touch and what not to touch. The psychological profile was harder to quantify. Tunnel rats had to function in pitch blackness, where flashlight beams revealed as much danger as they illuminated. They needed reflexes fast enough to respond to threats at arm's length before conscious thought could register what was happening, and they required the specific mental architecture that allowed continued operation, despite every instinct screaming to retreat from spaces where the walls pressed close enough to prevent turning around, and the only exit lay behind you through darkness that might now contain an enemy who heard you coming. The 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions established dedicated tunnel rat teams by mid-1966. Training was minimal because no one knew how to teach what these men would face underground. Instructors emphasized fire discipline, never more than 3 shots before reloading to prevent Viet Cong from rushing during the vulnerable seconds when the pistol was empty. They demonstrated how to use bayonets to probe for tripwires and pressure plates that triggered booby traps. They explained that red-lensed flashlights distinguished American tunnel rats from Viet Cong who used white lights and candles. The rest came down to survival instinct and the willingness to keep crawling forward when every rational calculation said stop. Most tunnel rats avoided alcohol, cigarettes, and even chewing gum because dulled senses meant death underground, where smell could detect explosives or the distinctive odor of Viet Cong fighters who lived on rice and fish sauce. Many developed superstitions and rituals that offered psychological comfort, if not actual protection. Some refused to enter tunnels on specific days. Others carried talismans or performed specific sequences of actions before descending. The psychological toll accumulated regardless. A significant percentage of volunteers completed 1 or 2 tunnel missions and then requested reassignment. No shame attached to the decision. The men who kept volunteering were either exceptionally courageous or had made peace with probabilities that guaranteed eventual injury or death. By late 1966, Viet Cong engineers began modifying tunnel defenses specifically to counter American tunnel rats. Passages narrowed in critical sections, false floors concealed punji stake pits. Grenades were wired to explode when tripwires were cut rather than pulled. Venomous snakes were placed in clay pots, positioned where crawling soldiers would break them accidentally. The evolutionary arms race had begun, and the American soldiers volunteering to fight underground were about to discover that courage alone could not overcome an enemy who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of killing in darkness. The standard tunnel rat loadout was determined by what could fit through an 18-inch passage and what could be used effectively in pitch darkness at arm's length. The M1911 .45 caliber pistol was issued first because it was available and powerful enough to stop an enemy with a single shot. Tunnel rats quickly discovered it was also loud enough to cause temporary deafness when fired in confined spaces where the muzzle blast had nowhere to dissipate. The flash left the shooter blind for critical seconds in darkness, where the Viet Cong fighter 3 feet away could see perfectly well. Some tunnel rats requested .38 special revolvers with sound suppressors. Others carried sawed-off shotguns or .25 caliber automatics. A few obtained World War II-era suppressed high-standard .22 pistols that fired subsonic ammunition quiet enough to preserve hearing. The flashlight was mandatory despite advertising the user's position because navigating by touch alone meant triggering every booby trap the Viet Cong had installed. Red-lensed flashlights eventually became standard after tunnel rats realized the Viet Cong used white lights and candles, making target identification marginally easier in firefights where both combatants were crawling toward each other through mud. The bayonet served multiple purposes. It probed for tripwires, it disabled pressure plate triggers, it killed venomous snakes, and in extremis it functioned as a silent weapon when ammunition ran out or noise discipline required stealth over firepower. What the tunnel rats faced underground rendered their equipment nearly irrelevant. Viet Cong engineers had perfected defensive tactics over 2 decades of tunnel warfare against the French and then Americans. Grenades were wired to low-clearance passages where crawling soldiers triggered tripwires by moving forward in the only position the tunnel dimensions allowed. The explosion in confined space multiplied the effective casualty radius beyond the grenade's rated specifications. Punji stakes were not simply sharpened bamboo planted in pits. They were fire-hardened, sometimes dipped in human excrement to cause infection, and arranged at angles calculated to penetrate boots and legs of soldiers, crawling on hands and knees or dragging themselves forward on their stomachs. False floors covered the pits. Weight distributed across hands and knees might hold. Concentrated weight on a single point triggered collapse. Venomous snakes presented unique horror. Bamboo vipers, kraits, and cobras were captured alive and placed in clay pots positioned where crawling soldiers would break them accidentally. The snakes struck reflexively in darkness where the victim could not see what had bitten them until venom was already circulating. Some tunnel complexes incorporated water traps. U-bend passages that could be flooded from chambers above would trap and drown tunnel rats who had crawled too far to retreat before the water level rose. Others required swimming through submerged sections where breath-holding capacity determined survival, and where any obstacle or entanglement meant drowning in muddy water that visibility did not penetrate. American engineers responded with countermeasures that proved marginally effective. Tunnel destruction teams used acetylene and oxygen mixtures to collapse shallow tunnels through controlled explosions. Deeper tunnels required cratering charges that demolished sections but rarely destroyed entire complexes. Chemical warfare agents, including CS riot control powder, were pumped into tunnel systems to deny their use for months. The Viet Cong simply sealed contaminated sections and dug around them. Smoke grenades revealed ventilation shaft locations, but also drove tunnel rats out before they could gather intelligence. Dogs trained to detect tunnel entrances could not avoid booby traps and were rarely used after initial casualties. The technological advantage that defined American military superiority on the surface evaporated underground, where victory depended on willingness to crawl through darkness toward an enemy who heard you coming and had spent 20 years preparing to kill you. For every tunnel destroyed, intelligence reports documented 3 more under construction. The Viet Cong possessed unlimited labor, local population support, and terrain that concealed excavation from aerial reconnaissance. Laterite clay hardened when exposed to air, creating self-supporting chambers that required minimal timbering. Tunnel networks expanded faster than American forces could map or destroy them. By 1968, reports began documenting tunnel rats who entered complexes and never returned. Some were killed by booby traps or enemy fire. Others simply disappeared into passages that connected to unmapped sections, where searches found no bodies and no evidence of what had happened to men who crawled into darkness and became part of it. The casualty statistics told a story that command briefings preferred not to emphasize. Between 1965 and 1972, Approximately 700 soldiers served as tunnel rats across all units in Vietnam. Of those, 36 were killed in action underground, with documented records. The actual number was certainly higher because tunnel operations often occurred during larger engagements, where cause of death was recorded as combat action rather than tunnel-specific casualty. The overall casualty rate for tunnel rat units approached 33% when wounded were included, a figure that exceeded casualty rates for airborne units, special forces, and most frontline infantry companies. The mathematics were brutally simple. Every tunnel entry was a calculated risk where survival depended on factors the soldier could not control. The Viet Cong knew the tunnels. Americans did not. The Viet Cong fought in darkness they had adapted to through years underground. Americans relied on flashlights that advertised their position and destroyed night vision the moment they were extinguished. Tunnel rats could not use radios underground because earth and laterite clay blocked transmissions at depths below 10 meters. No air support could reach them. No artillery could suppress enemy positions when both friendly and hostile forces occupied the same tunnels separated by yards of earth and rock. Reinforcements could not be rushed to a firefight happening in passages 18 inches wide, where only one man could advance at a time, and turning around meant backing out the way you came, while an enemy who might be following waited for the moment when your attention shifted from forward threat to rearward retreat. The tactical reality was that tunnel rats fought alone in spaces designed by the enemy, defended by soldiers who lived there, and equipped with traps that killed regardless of courage or training. Survival came down to experience, reflexes, and luck. The first could be learned, the second was innate, the third was random. Some tunnel rats survived dozens of missions through combinations of all three factors. They developed techniques that were never formalized in training manuals because they could not be taught. They learned to distinguish the sound of a tripwire brushing against cloth from the sound of rats moving through passages. They recognized the specific smell of explosives even when masked by earth and decay. They memorized tunnel layouts from intelligence reports and compared what they saw underground to maps that were often inaccurate, but occasionally revealed patterns that predicted where passages would turn or branch. They moved slowly enough to avoid triggering booby traps, but fast enough to prevent the Viet Cong from repositioning ahead of them. And they accepted that every corner might conceal an enemy soldier waiting in ambush with all the tactical advantage terrain and preparation could provide. The psychological aftermath manifested years after the war ended. Interviews with tunnel rat survivors documented pervasive post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by specific phobias directly traceable to tunnel warfare. Many could not enter basements or small rooms without experiencing panic attacks. Some avoided elevators or any enclosed space where walls pressed close and exits were not immediately visible. Nightmares of suffocation persisted decades after the last tunnel mission. Dreams of being trapped underground while enemies closed in from passages that stretched into infinity. The recurring sensation of walls pressing inward until breathing became impossible and darkness became absolute. Therapists working with Vietnam veterans noted that tunnel rats displayed psychological trauma patterns distinct from other combat infantry. The terror was not generalized combat stress, but specific claustrophobic panic tied to memories of crawling through spaces designed to kill them. By 1969, volunteer rates for tunnel rat duty had declined noticeably. Word spread through infantry units about what waited underground. Soldiers who might have volunteered in 1966 out of curiosity or desire for specialized duty now requested any assignment except tunnel operations. Unit commanders stopped asking for volunteers and began selecting soldiers based on physical qualifications alone, a practice that violated the informal understanding that tunnel work could only be done by men who chose it willingly. The declining volunteer rate reflected rational calculation by soldiers who had access to casualty statistics and survivor accounts that made clear the job offered disproportionate risk for questionable strategic gain. And as American ground forces began drawing down in preparation for Vietnamization, fewer tunnel rats entered the earth to fight an enemy that had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of killing in darkness. By 1970, internal military assessments acknowledged what field commanders had known for years. Tunnel destruction missions had not significantly degraded Viet Cong operational capability. Intelligence reports documented over 250 kilometers of tunnel networks across Kyu District in the Iron Triangle. Engineers had collapsed thousands of tunnel sections using explosives and chemical agents. The Viet Cong simply dug new passages around destroyed sections or reopened collapsed tunnels after American forces moved to different operational areas. Each tunnel destruction required deploying specialized teams, explosives, and often tunnel rats to map sections before demolition. The Viet Cong needed only shovels, time, and labor drawn from local population that supported their presence or feared the consequences of refusing. The mathematics were inexorable. Destruction cost American lives and resources. Construction cost the Viet Cong nothing but dirt and sweat. The strategic futility became undeniable as the war shifted toward Vietnamization and American withdrawal. Tunnel systems that had operated throughout the conflict remained operational. The Tet Offensive of 1968 had been planned and coordinated from command centers located in Cu Chi tunnels that American forces had been trying to destroy since 1965. Major Viet Cong units continued using the tunnels for troop movement, logistics, and medical treatment regardless of how many individual passages were demolished. The underground infrastructure proved as indestructible as the guerrilla movement it supported. Both were sustained by population will, terrain advantage, and simple endurance against technologically superior forces that could not remain indefinitely in a country where they did not belong. Tunnel rat operations were quietly scaled back as ground combat units began withdrawing from Vietnam. The last significant tunnel missions occurred in 1971 as part of Operation Dong Tien, the final major U.S. ground operation of the war. After American forces departed, the tunnels remained exactly where they had always been, beneath the earth of Cu Chi District, empty of soldiers but preserved as monuments to a war that technology could not win and courage alone could not end. What tunnel warfare proved was uncomfortable truth that military strategists preferred not to emphasize. Firepower could not defeat an enemy willing to live underground. Air superiority meant nothing when battles occurred 10 meters beneath the surface. Technological advantage evaporated in confined spaces, where the soldier with local knowledge possessed every tactical benefit over the soldier with night vision equipment and communications gear that did not function through earth and rock. The tunnel rats had fought with extraordinary courage in conditions that few human beings would voluntarily endure. Their bravery was documented. Their casualties were recorded. But courage could not substitute for strategic advantage when the strategic advantage belonged entirely to the enemy, who had spent 2 decades preparing the battlefield and possessed unlimited time to continue the war as long as necessary. Today, the Cu Chi tunnels operate as tourist attractions. Sections have been widened to accommodate average-sized visitors who crawl through passages on guided tours that last 30 minutes and cover perhaps 100 meters of the 250-kilometer network. The tunnels are well lit now. Ventilation has been improved. The booby traps are diffused exhibits. Tourists emerge into sunlight and gift shops selling souvenirs, having experienced a sanitized version of what American tunnel rats faced in darkness without knowing if the next corner concealed an enemy soldier or a trap designed to kill anyone who came within its radius. The Vietnamese government has preserved the tunnels as national historical sites and symbols of resistance against foreign intervention. They attract over 500,000 visitors annually who walk above ground that was once a battlefield and crawl through passages that were once tombs for men who entered them, knowing they might never return but went anyway because someone had to, and they had volunteered.